This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. Hey Darklings, Kaylin here. We know our generation has a surplus of pretty darkness in common, and if there's one thing unpacking our upbringing has taught us, it's just how essential therapy is for shining a flashlight on the darkness in our own lives. I don't know where I'd be without mine. I believe every human can benefit from the perspective of a licensed therapist. Whether you're familiar with your own inner workings or you're just looking for a listening ear, you can give BetterHelp online therapy a try by going to betterhelp.com/prettydark and receive 10% off your first month. I get that online therapy can be tricky, but I've been seeing my therapist online since 2020, and I'm here to tell you that it's absolutely worth it. Getting started is always the hardest part, and BetterHelp makes that easy. You can begin right from your phone or computer in whatever way makes you most comfortable, via good old-fashioned phone calls, video chats, or even messaging, if that's more your style. We enjoy this frightful nostalgia and learning about how it all connects, but Darklings know we're also passionate about healing and growing from what we learn. If you dare to do the same, head to betterhelp.com/prettydark. There you can answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people like us. Plus, you can switch therapists at any time, so you're sure to find the right connection. Millennials are ditching the stigma and owning our mental health. And with BetterHelp, you can build a relationship with a professional all from the comfort of your own home, just how we like it. Visit betterhelp.com/prettydark or choose That's Pretty Dark podcast during sign up and enjoy 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/prettydark.
You're listening to That's Pretty Dark,
The podcast where we talk about all the entertainment that scared us as children
and still haunts us as adults. So grab your flashlight and join us as we take a frightfully nostalgic look over our shoulders
and under our beds
and in our closets.
And together we'll realize, whoa, that's pretty dark.
Happy Easter, snot faces. Yo, snot faces.
God.
Sounds like we're a couple of snot faces.
I am. I'm a bona fide snot face.
You know, I was just thinking, this movie would be perfect as an Easter-themed movie.
Could you explain your thinking, please?
I just feel like, because, so much childhood, trauma, turning old memories on their heads,
Okay.
She goes home for Easter. I mean, it would ruin the entire, inciting incident and everything. But, maybe the sequel. Maybe there's all this talk
Easter
about
sequel
sequels.
for Drop Dead Fred.
An Easter Drop Dead Fred sequel.
The two things just exist so independently and separately in my brain.
But look at how beautiful, look at all the pastels, all the colors, everything.
All right, just for pastel colors.
Can you imagine the Easter egg hunt that he would put on? What's in those eggs?
I don't want to know.
I do. Here on That's Pretty Dark, my name is Christian.
My name is Kaylin.
And tonight, we're getting reacquainted with a wild old childhood chum who befriended us back when we all needed him most. Drop Dead Fred. The 1991 controversial dark comedy turned cult classic film featuring the pseudo-imaginary character of the same name, who's also quite controversial himself.
I'm glad you said the word controversial.
Which has been described in a Den of Geek article as a post-punk comedy in every sense. In brief, Drop Dead Fred is the answer to the question, what would happen if your whole entire adult life fell apart in one day, and your childhood imaginary friend showed up to help you put it all back together again?
Isn't that what this podcast is?
Quite literally this podcast. And that's also the story of Lizzie, our protagonist, who loses what writer Mark Harrison calls the three totems of adulthood: her marriage, her job, and her car, all in the span of one lunch hour. And after being forced to move back in with her emotionally abusive mother and sleep in her perfectly preserved childhood bedroom, Lizzie is revisited by the make-believe companion she had when she was a little girl, Drop Dead Fred, who destroys all remaining semblances of her crumbling adulthood,
just for funsies,
haphazardly clearing the path that leads toward Lizzie's own reconstruction of self.
I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Absolutely zero.
Yeah? None?
I have never seen this movie.
I didn't think you had.
I knew nothing about this movie except that he gets his head squished. That's it.
Yes.
That's all I have ever known.
All the promos, all the pictures, all the... Yeah, the previews.
And it turns out that's really
famous visual.
Yeah, and that really has very little to do with the movie at all. So
that is one of the things I've always remembered about it.
But it is a wild ride.
That squishy
It's
head.
because it reminds me of like the Gushers commercials. We've talked about that
totally.
before. So that's the only reason that memory or image even stuck, because the only thing I would have seen at any point in my childhood would have been a promo, or like, you know, like a commercial on another VHS tape or something.
Right.
That's the only way I would have come into contact with it.
I didn't put those together, but I was just thinking it's familiar because I know this movie, but it's because of the freaking Gushers commercials.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome. That's what I'm here to do for you and everybody else.
And much like Lizzie, I too haven't seen Fred since I was far too young to be watching this movie. And like Lizzie, I also forgot about Fred for nearly 30 years until we first started planning for this show and brainstorming childhood favorites. So I've been wanting to get to this one for quite a while, but I knew we finally had our launching off point for it after discussing emotional projection in our Rescuer series. Because when it comes to emotional projection onto inanimate objects, or in this case, imaginary friends, Drop Dead Fred is the pretty dark crown jewel.
Fair enough. Our experiences with this movie could not be in more stark contrast, because from the opening lines, I understood why my child self never, ever, ever would have seen this film.
Your existence. Yeah.
It just wouldn't have happened.
Your parents tried, it would have been like, oh, turn that off now.
Yeah, it would have been instantaneous. So even an attempt would not have been successful for me. But it was, I'll say, very interesting to watch it for the first time in my 30s as a connoisseur and lover of 90s movies, because I like that you described it as post-punk. And it's confusing to me that it ever could have or would have been marketed toward kids or even young teenagers, because most of everything in this film would go right over most kids' heads.
It's PG-13 teetering on R.
I would say so as well.
It's up there. It's really up there.
Honestly, when I first was watching it, I was making notes and I was like, can we cover this movie?
Yes, I honestly,
why are we covering this movie?
When I knew you'd seen it, but we hadn't heard from you, I genuinely thought the silence was deafening. It was this disapproval. Kaylin saying, I really can't believe we're doing this on our show, but it's too late.
Yeah.
And I can't tell him anything different.
I did feel some of those things. I wouldn't call it like
I figured.
Intensely, but I did have some of those thoughts. But I also, as I told Christian before we started recording, didn't text him about the movie because I wanted to save my thoughts for the episode, which is not uncommon.
Yeah.
But I can see why you would have taken the silence a little more personally this time.
Well, don't worry. I rewatched the movie for the first time in maybe 30 years before greenlighting it for myself. I had to make sure it actually passed our own personal litmus test for the show to make sure that it works. There's a lot of reasons why it belongs on the show. Thematically,
conceptually, yes, definitely. In execution, it's questionable, but Darklings will let you be the judges.
Everybody has their own opinions, and we're going to get into all of it, and I'm very excited. I'm so glad, we're coming at it from two different angles, but I'm glad we're meeting in the middle on it. Because, this is the conversation that everyone has about this movie. Mm-hmm. So at least we're meeting the standard of Drop Dead Fred. Yeah.
We're on track somehow.
So if you never saw it as a kid, like Kaylin, you'd probably have a very similar allergic reaction to it that most every grown-up had back in 91. Mm-hmm. Symptoms include cringing, discomfort, annoyance, disgust. The list goes on and on.
Yeah.
And I can't blame you for that because, spoiler, that's kind of the whole point. Mm-hmm. So my glasses aren't nearly rose-colored enough to presuppose that everyone our age harbors an innate affection for this movie. But I'm glad to hear that you didn't hate it.
Hate would be a strong word.
Yeah.
I hated elements of it.
Sure.
But again, as you said,
of course,
I think that's the point.
That's the point. But if you did see it as a kid, like me, and particularly if you enjoyed it and watched it over and over as many chances as you got, although on television...
So much more about you is making sense to me now.
Right? On television, mind you. So the TV edits, the content cuts.
Yeah.
You may very well agree with me that despite being made by and for Gen X, it's truly, at its core, one of the most millennial movies ever made.
Mm-hmm. They just didn't even know it yet.
And at first I thought I was crazy for thinking so, but I'd already written down the phrase ahead of its time in multiple places before I realized that that's what literally everyone who talks about this film says about this film.
Mm-hmm. It's like a Jennifer's Body.
Yeah.
No one knew it the way they should have.
No one knew.
When they should have.
Wish I knew Jennifer's Body. Hey.
Don't we all?
But I hope by the end of the series, you will all at least understand what we mean by that, even if you don't agree with us.
Yeah, we don't have to agree to have a good time.
Exactly. But if you are, for some reason, hate listening to this episode because of your negative obsession with this film and its undying legacy,
that could be
you're
fun
not
too.
alone out there either. Drop Dead Fred is everyone's favorite 90s movie to shit on.
Mm-hmm.
Upon its release, it was devastatingly panned by critics who couldn't seem to find strong enough words to express their distaste for it. A 2021 article from The Telegraph said, "The damning reviews that it garnered saw critics on both sides of the Atlantic vie with one another to come up with hyperbole. And yet, like most heavily criticized films, it ultimately managed to garner a cult following that I personally am a proud member of." I don't know if that makes me a Fred head or like a Drop Dead head.
Fred head, probably.
Fred head?
Yeah.
Something like that. The thing that no critic could have had the foresight to understand is that this film is a paradox. It's the kind of movie that could have only been made in the 80s or 90s, and yet it was still way too far ahead of its time to be appreciated. People were still just too confused by the concept of mental health, and were still made too uncomfortable by mental illness. Blech. Ew, gross.
That's a truth.
Yuck.
It's getting better. It's on a better trend, but...
Which is a lot of the reason why this movie is still relevant 30 years later. But mental illness in film back then was typically reserved for thrillers and horrors and comedies that made fun of it. Not comedies like Drop Dead Fred, which not only accepted mental illness as a normal part of some people's lives, but used it as a tool to explore the human experience and shed light on a rarely engaged perspective. In those days, mental illness was still something to be mocked in the daylight and feared in the darkness. It was constantly misunderstood, therefore misinterpreted, and therefore misrepresented over and over again. Drop Dead Fred was one of those rare films that relied on a psychological disorder for the sake of comedy without judgment or abuse of the reality of that disorder. And what I mean by that is, it didn't blame Lizzie for her mental illness or paint her in a contaminated light. Instead, it actually successfully villainized those in her life who did blame her for it, her mother and her husband, who used it against her to manipulate her, belittle her, and control her. But, like usual, I'm getting way ahead of myself.
I wanted to jump in with comments, but I'm like, this isn't the time. There's no time. We'll wait. We'll save it.
Because, that may be where it ended up in the hearts and minds of us 80s and 90s kids who grew up cherishing this movie, and where it's going to end up on our, podcast. But that's not necessarily where it began. Like the film's director, Ate de Jong, once said about it, "The deeper layers come later. You can't avoid those once you start working." So Ate de Jong called this film intentionally anti-intellectual. And I think that's pretty ironic, because the very few articles I found about this movie are actually some of the most well-written, insightful, and genuinely intelligent sources I've ever used on the show, which is such a strange juxtaposition. But I reckon if you're going to intellectually analyze a film that's designed to make fun of you while you're doing it, I think you have to be smarter than the film is trying to be dumb.
You have to be able to separate all of those through lines and figure out where you actually fall and where it's telling you that you fall.
And one of these sources is an article from The Telegraph called Rick Mayall's Mental Health Misadventure, How Drop Dead Fred Repelled America. And this was written by Alexandra Larman. Another is a Den of Geek article written by Mark Harrison called Drop Dead Fred, Looking Back on a Cult Classic, which begins with the incredible opening paragraph. "Hey, snot faces, what do you get when you mix Mary Poppins and Beetlejuice? Look no further than 1991's Drop Dead Fred, a fantasy comedy about an imaginary friend, which turns out to be about a woman's mental breakdown after years and years of emotional abuse."
Valid. True.
And another we won't really get to until part 2 is a Downtime article by Caroline Golem called All Grown Up, The Arrested Development of Drop Dead Fred. And this one does an excellent job of succinctly analyzing the multiple layers of this film, while gracefully admitting that some of those layers are a bit thinner than others, i.e. the dime store psychoanalysis and the ex machina convenience of Mickey Bunce's reappearance in Lizzie's life. The rest, however, is a wonderfully enlightened glimpse into the otherwise painfully realistic blending of imagination and trauma as an emotionally abused little kid grows up into a psychologically broken adult. My life story.
Many of us, I think.
Not quite to the extreme that Lizzie is broken in my case. She's more of a cluster A, but I've been rocking those cluster Bs and Cs since I was about 17, I think. So I'm feeling it.
You're in the club.
I'm in the club. This movie, again, one of the most millennial movies ever, like resonates with me deeper now than it ever could have when I was a kid. But growing up with this film and blending it in my psyche with two other similar but different childhood favorites, Little Monsters and Beetlejuice, I always vaguely but fondly remembered the weird fever dream-like comedy about a girl who had this magical best friend who was always getting her into trouble. Sometimes I remembered him as a monster, sometimes he was a ghost, but more often than not, I remembered him as a dead guy.
Well,
and that probably has a lot to do with the name Drop Dead Fred.
Sure. I mean, that's kind of what I assumed. I thought it was sort of a zombie or like a friend come back to life.
Right.
I understood that he was probably imaginary, but I thought he was like a reawakening or reemergence of a character or person that we knew or she knew or something.
That's how I've always thought of this movie.
And or he was making other people drop dead. I wasn't sure.
He was a murderous
imaginary friend.
That could be a fun sequel, actually. But I keep thinking there's another movie out there from this time that I am mistaking it for.
That wouldn't surprise me.
There are 3 different meanings to the phrase drop dead, and I think all of them apply brilliantly in their own way. The first is the most obvious, the insulting command to drop dead. Tongue-in-cheek, I think Fred finds his name hilarious, knowing that he's routinely so obnoxious that any boring old grown-up would want him to drop dead. Plus, I'd imagine that, pretending to drop dead would be one of his favorite gags to pull. See Jim dying of boredom in The Office. The others are more subtle, but more to the point. The most common use of drop dead as an adjective is drop dead gorgeous. See the 1999 film starring Kirsten Dunst and Kirstie Alley. And this meaning is more along the lines of something awe-inspiring, astonishing, or envious. And the other meaning of this adjective, based on dictionary.com's reckoning, is being the most extreme limit or possibility. And the most common use for this meaning is a drop-dead date, implying the last possible date that something can happen, or a drop-dead offer, which is the last and final offer.
My corporate girlies know what that's all about.
Yes. So in essence, Drop-Dead Fred is the most extreme, awe-inspiring version of a Fred imaginable. Emphasis on the imaginable.
Are you sure we haven't already seen that on our show? He also used a shaver sometimes.
Good.
I think if that is the criteria, there's one Fred that's a head above all the drop dead heads.
Yeah, I know. This Fred wasn't shaving any dogs, shaving any pancakes into a dog's mouth.
Freaky guy, freaky reference.
The person who actually imagined Drop Dead Fred into existence is named Elizabeth Livingston.
Okay.
And the screenplay was written by writing duo Carlos Davis and Anthony Fingleton, both of whom became executive producers of the film. And there's little to no information on these writers, except that Tony Fingleton was a former competitive swimmer, and there's exactly, checks notes, 0 information on Elizabeth.
Well, that's so unfortunate, because I was very excited to learn about her.
I know. I want to know more. So if anybody knows anything, let us know.
The character's named after her.
I was going to say,
yes. Sort of an autobiographical, self-referential sort of situation? We don't know.
We don't know. But at the very least, the writers used her name for the name of the main character. So maybe there was something there. Maybe she just kind of had a similar experience in a very realistic way and kind of said...
You mean she didn't actually have a guy coming to her in her bedroom late at night to whisper crazy things and ideas into her ear?
Any schizotypal personality disorders? No, I don't think so. But maybe. For all we know, she did.
You never know.
And she's often credited as...
Perhaps it was more in tribute.
She's often credited as being one of the writers, but everything says story by Elizabeth Livingston, so we know how that goes.
It's the kind of thing that definitely could have been based on a book, and I halfway expected you to tell me that it was.
Well, no, but there is some thought out there that it might be loosely based, unlicensed, of course, on some stories by a writer named Jonathan Carroll, and so a lot of people are like, ooh, this is similar to his works, but there's no proof that his stuff inspired any of these writers.
Kind of like mouse movies were in vogue. Maybe this kind of thinking was just out there.
we were just talking with a very special person.
Special person to the podcast. Yes, we were.
Yeah, we were talking a lot about how things just sort of float through the ether, and whoever's paying attention can grab that from the muse that's, giving them the inspiration. So
some kind of magical combination of culture and groupthink and the zeitgeist and that
collective
magical
unconscious ideas.
Faded thing.
But the story that I came up with in my own head is that Elizabeth Livingston knew either Carlos Davis or Anthony Finkelton and just sort of pitched them this idea that she had. Maybe they were friends or something. And according to IMDb trivia further, they first went to Disney with it. It does seem like a Disney film. And, at its core. But they wanted...
You say that.
They wanted nothing to do with Rick Mayall. So these guys pivoted and then pitched the idea to working title. They went straight to the executives Tim Bevan and Sarah Radcliffe, who were the ones who recommended Ate de Jong for director, and they brought on Paul Webster to produce because he just produced The Tall Guy for them in '89. And Webster went on to do a bunch of other things, but his greatest claims to fame are Pride and Prejudice and Atonement.
Very different.
Atonement is such a good film.
Good films. Great films. Very, very different films.
Fantastic movies. Very different. Working Title was a British production company, and Polygram was technically an American studio, but was well on its way to becoming Hollywood's European competitor. And both are now owned by Universal, I believe.
It feels like a Universal movie. It had a lot of touches and like the general vibe was a lot like Gremlins, and Gremlins was Universal, and I associate that all together. Like, but this was different. It wasn't a Spielberg Universal type film, so.
No, not quite.
But
Didn't quite
I
have
did
the
get the
budget
vibe.
for that.
There was something there.
It did have that 80s feel, though.
Definitely.
That 80s movie kind of pallor to it. And like I said, those studio executives were recommending Ate de Jong to the writers. But the thing is, Polygram, who was the other production company that made this movie, they just produced the 1989 Batman film alongside Warner Brothers. So Tim Burton was actually their first pick for director. But Tim had also just made Beetlejuice in '88. So he'd already kind of done this concept.
I had all those thoughts too. I was like,
on a much grander scale.
This could have been Tim Burton, but Tim Burton had Beetlejuice. He didn't need this.
He didn't need to do this one, right?
I had that whole like train.
But they did want him.
I understand why.
And while we're on the subject of first picks, any guesses on who was first offered the role of Drop Dead Fred, Kaylin?
It feels to me like a Robin Williams.
You nailed it. That's it.
Yeah.
Yes, they first offered it to Robin Williams.
I only say that because, like, it isn't a Robin Williams role.
No, it's not. But if you think
so
90s
irreverent,
comic,
not that he has been, but not this irreverent, right? Like, there's a spectrum.
Not to this point.
This is not a Robin Williams irreverent like role, but the wacky out there. Just constant voices and tricks and all that stuff.
Well, look at a master of comic improvisation, Robin Williams.
Jim Carrey even could have said Jim Carrey.
This was before him. This was before
his time.
He was famous.
Could have been his breakout role. He could have been.
I don't know what it was. I can't speak to it. I didn't look into that necessarily. But yeah, Robin Williams. And it's funny because I don't know how this all worked out. There's a lot of contradictory information out there, especially on the IMDb trivia. But apparently the writers wrote it for Rick Mayall, but I think maybe the studios wanted Robin Williams because why not?
I mean, of course, you want to name.
You're going to make money if it's Robin Williams. But when he turned it down, they were like, okay, Rick Mayall.
Also, when you ask me that question, I go into like a mode of if I were casting this film, like if I kind of knew what it was or if I was directing this film.
Right.
And I'll get to this point later. I'll say all of my thoughts and feelings. But if I were going to do this concept, which very appealing to me, something I think I would have loved to have done,
sure.
I would have cast Robin Williams and it would have been slightly more wholesome. Not full Disney, but I would have gone a more wholesome direction with it, but say all the same stuff.
Right.
Be edgy, be different.
Have
Robin
the same
Williams,
story arc.
have the same story
points.
arc. Yes.
Right.
But just ever so slightly more of a wholesome tilt.
Well,
and Robin Williams could do that, in my opinion.
If you had, it would have made a lot more money and it would have been a much greater mainstream success.
If only they weren't looking to do this the year before I was born.
Yeah, I know. It's too bad.
Such a bummer. Really missed that one.
But, Robin Williams had a pretty good reason for turning this role down.
Aladdin.
No, not quite.
Well, it was Aladdin. Well, Aladdin came out
No.
in 91, so it's probably already made.
Aladdin came out in 92.
Okay, 92. So yeah, so then yeah, my guess is spot on. Why wasn't it Aladdin? You're correcting me, but you're making me more correct.
He turned it down specifically to play Peter Banning in Hook.
Of course.
Yes,
of course.
yes. But he did make so many other movies at the same time. He did make Aladdin, and he did make Ferngully, the last rainforest.
That was 92 as well.
He was very busy.
He was very busy.
Between 90 and 92, he was making 11 feature films.
Holy shit.
In that 3-year time span. 11 came out.
We've talked about that whenever we were talking about Ferngully, like how he was kind of back and forth and how Disney didn't want to let him do Ferngully because he was playing Genie and all that stuff. But I'm shocked Disney let him work on 9 other films at that time.
So, like I said, they wrote it for Rick Mayall, apparently, so I don't know how or when he was officially offered the role, but once he was attached, he was the one who actually gave final approval of Ate de Jong.
Wow.
Because it became Rick Mayall's film.
I mean, I guess it had to.
So the story is optioned, and the screenplay is written, and the script is further rewritten by Paul Webster, the producer, under the close supervision of Ate de Jong. And although Webster has stated that
the basic structure didn't change, my memory is that the final film was pretty close to the shooting script. The madcap tone was very much at the heart of the film from the start.
That Telegraph article said that de Jong worked closely with Mayall and the writers to turn the final version into something more sophisticated and darker. De Jong has since been very open about putting a lot of himself into the story's more emotional intricacies, specifically citing his own personal childhood trauma of being abused by his older half-brother.
So even if it wasn't Elizabeth's story or her trauma, that theme did carry through from some of the creators.
He told The Telegraph,
I was molested as a very young child by my older half-brother. I have no memory of it. It was very suppressed, but my body does. The trauma of child abuse goes deep, and its claws reach far in time. It was not something ever spoken about on the set, not with Rick or anyone, but for me, it existed. And that's how it is. It's so isolating, and you are alone in it, you feel, although it's so common.
It's so
and
common.
People just
Way
don't
more
talk about
than
it.
I ever realized. So, yes, if you guys are picking up on those more uncomfortable subtleties of some kind of secret, silent abuse in this film that goes beyond what we're seeing on the screen, then you're not wrong, and you're very much not alone in that.
Yeah.
The whole thing carries this sense of impending doom.
Yeah.
Suggesting that we're all in for a devastating reveal, like the one found at the end of The Perks of Being a Wallflower. And I could have swore we were going to find out about, the real reason why Lizzie's father left, because he was, found out and sent packing, which arguably would have made her mother a slightly more sympathetic character. It could have made for a much more bittersweet ending to their storyline than the cliche poetic justice of Lizzie's backhanded final punchline about how maybe she should make a friend too, or whatever.
Yeah. Although I liked that.
It was nice. I mean, the 80s and 90s just wouldn't have been the same without the punchy cleverness of those goosebumps walkaways, as Nick Miller calls them.
I definitely felt that impending doom that you're talking about, and it never really felt like we got there. But I think that also speaks to mental illness and mental health and how a lot of those disorders kind of have you in that headspace all the time, whether or not you arrive. So
that's such a good point.
I mean, I feel like it was kind of accomplished.
It's always just there.
Unless you're me, and then oftentimes there is a payoff. But
wow. It's like something beneath the wallpaper that's like rippling.
Yeah.
And then you just never, it just like goes away and never comes back. And you're like, what was that?
Yeah.
It's that feeling all the time, constantly.
Yeah.
Like there's something just beneath the surface ready to reveal itself. And then you realize it was just all in your head the whole time.
I wondered very often as I was watching how my child self or even teenage self would have interpreted or internalized this film. And I know I would have hated it for all the same reasons my parents would have hated it. But if I had looked a little closer, there were plenty of films at the time that my parents didn't like that I found the merit in and understood at a deeper level.
You would have appreciated the ending, I think.
Yeah, I think so too.
Even,
and so I wonder kind of at
it.
What age that might have hit for me.
I think you would have found it in your early 20s if you'd watched it. You'd have been like, but
early 20s for sure. But yeah, teen Kaylin, I just don't know.
At any point in your life, though, you would have had to make it through the first hour 20 to get there.
Right. And that would have been unlikely for me for a while.
I don't know if you would have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because even Gremlins, like I didn't watch all of Gremlins as a kid for similar reasons. I was not like a gross out factor, just did nothing for me.
And that's all this movie is.
It just got me thinking, you know. That's what we're here doing is thinking about these things from when we were younger. And in this case, I kept thinking like, how would my life have been different, or what would I have reflected on later if I had this in my brain when I was very young?
Right.
What would I have come back to mentally?
Right.
That's kind of the vein that I was thinking in.
That's one thing about this movie. Really gets you thinking. The other person who was instrumental in the completion of the script and film as a whole was the gentle and generous Rick Mayall, R.I.P., who played Drop Dead Fred. As Larman in his Telegraph article put it,
Rick Mayall was an enthusiastic and willing contributor who eschewed improvisation on set in favor of sticking to the script. DeYoung said, Rick was beyond a delight. He was very loyal and, of course, very inventive. In my mind, there's no question that the impact of Drop Dead Fred is first and foremost his credit. That is so wild.
Right?
Because it all feels like improv.
Doesn't it?
For sure.
Absolutely does. That's the genius of him as an actor. He can take fully scripted material and just make it sound off the cuff, like offhand.
That
just
is a very
aloof.
surprising thing that I did not expect to read. You mentioned The Office earlier. It's like that, where it feels so organic to him because he is doing that work. He is acting. He is embodying the character.
Right.
And when you can make something feel like improv, you're doing acting right.
You're doing your job right. Yes. He takes it and he does so much with it that it feels like a very genuine moment. Like it just came from his mind, whereas, you know, it came from the page. But he did have a lot of say in the script. So a lot of that may have just been pre-planned on his part, you know, and he just kind of knew exactly what he was going to do with it when he pitched it. And they said, okay, great.
Improv by writing the script yourself. So it's not really,
well, you know,
it's not technically improv, but it did come from your improvisational brain when you wrote it.
There are a lot of writers who kind of poo-poo that idea and they look at improv and they go, writing is improv. Literally every moment that you put a word on a page, that's improvisation. I
don't disagree with that.
It's long form improvisation.
But if you're the person writing it, it's improv for you. If you're reciting the script, not so much.
So Rick Mayall was one of the UK's most famous alternative comedians. And as he himself once put it, I had a very happy childhood, happy teenage years, and I was famous by the time I was 22, a charmed life. And by that, he means that his parents were both drama teachers, and his theater acting debut came at the age of 7 in one of his father's plays. A decade later, at Manchester University, he made a new best friend who would become his comedy partner, Adrian Edmondson, and the two developed a comedy act together called 20th Century Coyote, which they performed at Comedy Store in London until they moved venues to the comic strip, where they were finally discovered by a producer named Paul Jackson, who launched their television careers around 1980 when Rick was 22. By 24, he was one of the most popular comedians in the UK. And from there, he did decades of British television, including a 1995 TV movie adaptation of The Wind in the Willows, 26 episodes of a Watership Down series as Kihar,
whoa,
and 1 episode of Midsummer Murders. That's for my sister, Lindsay. He also voiced Lord Reginald in Season 4, Episode 10 of SpongeBob SquarePants.
Of course he did.
And based on a lot of what I've read, his performance as Drop Dead Fred is pretty much exactly what you could expect from any number of his other roles. I don't know any of his other work personally, but he was so well known in the UK that Benedict Cumberbatch, who was quite the impressionist, once did a comedic reading of a letter of complaint that Rick once wrote to the Band-Aid Company.
Oh no.
In Rick's voice for a charity event. And absolutely nailed it.
Bob Geldof, basement flat, 126B, Kilburn High Road, London. Sorry, Rick. 26th of November 1984. Dear Bob, love your work. Or I did until I turned up yesterday at Air Studios to do my bit for Band-Aid.
Rick was out there writing Yelp reviews, probably.
Yeah, it was a wild complaint. Robin Williams may have passed on the role, but once they signed Rick Mayall, he was very involved in the story and the writing of the script, as we've said. Alexander Larman wrote that many of the gags were devised by him and much of Fred's dialogue, too. He had a lot of freedom in interpreting the character, and he was the comedic driving force of the film. Rick had a knack for self-awareness and for describing himself better than anybody else could, saying things like, "I was always a show-off and liable to get overexcited," and "there's a quality about me that you don't quite trust."
Yeah, I thought that was the character, but hey, again, he was just so good.
That's just him. Well, during an on-set interview one day, he said, "Fred's imaginary, so he can be anything. He can be over the top and loud and stupid and childish, so that means I can be me." And my favorite trivia fact about him is that he was cast as Peeves the Poltergeist in the first Harry Potter movie, but he kept making the kids laugh in every take, so they had to cut all of his scenes.
Nice. Nice. What a legacy.
He said before that he thought the movie was, quoting, "shit," but he's also said, "but I still got the money. So that's the most exciting film I've ever been in, because I got the oodle and I wasn't in it. Fantastic."
I'm getting a sense of Rick Mayall.
But then, after a jog one morning in 2014, when Rick Mayall was only 56 years old, he suddenly passed away from a heart attack.
So young.
One day you're joking about surviving the male menopause of melancholia, and the next, your heart stops working, and it's over.
That's how it goes.
To continue here with the casting for a moment longer, this is the second movie night in 4 months that stars Phoebe Cates.
It is indeed.
So, if you'd like a more detailed look at her career, you should totally go check out part 1 of our Gremlins series. But it is worth mentioning that Gremlins 2, The New Batch, came out just the year prior, in 1990.
People that knew of Phoebe Cates knew she had also kind of been typecast.
Yeah.
Very different characters, but I would still argue typecast.
That childhood trauma come full term.
It's just there was a little more awareness in her Gremlins character.
The others considered for the role of Lizzie were Winona Ryder.
Yes, that makes sense. I was gonna if you were gonna ask me to guess, that was gonna be the one. But the only reason I would guess that is because Beetlejuice, really.
Right. And that's actually why she turned it down, because she was sick of being typecasted in these like weird offbeat comedies. She was like, "I'm more than that. I have more to give than that." So
You did, Winona.
she did. She does.
You do.
Also, Molly Ringwald, Julia Roberts, Jennifer Connelly.
Jennifer Connelly. Makes sense.
Carrie Green, and Uma Thurman.
Uma Thurman could have done it.
I think so.
Would have been very interesting then if she'd done it and then Maya Hawke comes along and kind of gets the same sort of roles.
That's perfect. The remake.
Yeah.
The sequel.
Maya Hawke.
Hollywood, you guys listening? Are you even out there
as
anymore?
we know, spoiler alert, Darklings, but as we know, Fred gets passed down. He doesn't disappear.
Oh, absolutely. For all we know, he looks different. And talks
is there
different.
a place for him in 2025?
You better believe there's a place for him. The funny thing is, we've already highlighted both of the actresses who play both versions of Lizzie.
Yes.
Phoebe Cates and
Ashley
Peldon, who is none other than
Darla
the speaking
Dimple.
voice and the screaming voice of the one, the only, Darla Dimple.
Darla Dimple. When I saw Ashley Peldon in the opening credits, I was like, hey, I did the Leo meme face.
Yeah.
I know her.
Lizzie's mother, Polly, the Mega Beast, was played by Marsha Mason, who, according to her IMDb bio, was a resoundingly respected and popular film actress of the 1970s and 1980s, whose career skyrocketed in the bittersweet comedies, dramas of award-winning Neil Simon, to whom she was married for about a decade. And one of her earliest credits was playing a vampire girl in one episode of Dark Shadows. And she's appeared in episodes of shows such as Seinfeld, Frasier, Nightmares and Dreamscapes from the stories of Stephen King, and most recently, Grace and Frankie, which I've never seen.
Me neither.
But people like it. Lizzie's husband, Charles, was played by Tim Matheson, who had a much more expansive career than I would have imagined. Not only was he the voice of the original Johnny Quest,
Whoa.
but he also voiced the title character of Sinbad Jr. and his magic belt. He was Jace in Space Ghost, but he was also the narrator of the 1985 Fantasia.
Really?
Yeah,
I didn't hear
weird.
it. So random.
Yeah, I don't know.
But I was so focused on how much I hated him that I wouldn't have heard it probably unless I really tried.
Everything says he was uncredited as the narrator, so I can't prove that it was him. Maybe it wasn't.
Who knows?
But that's what the internet says. And we can always
Trust the internet. with our bluebirds and such.
He played John Haynes in 20 episodes of The West Wing. He was Dr. Breland in 70 episodes of Heart of Dixie. Dr. Mullins in 64 episodes of Virgin River. Kaylin, you probably know him as Dave Malone in This Is Us.
Okay. It's been a long time since I watched it, but...
I recognize him as Edward Tregoran from Evil, but most people probably recognize him as Otter from Animal House. The others considered for his role were Alec Baldwin, Jeff Goldblum, Jeffrey Jones, and Rick Moranis.
No! Absolutely not.
I could see Jeff Goldblum, though.
Oh, he'd do a great job.
He would have nailed it.
I can see him wanting to actively parody and caricature that character.
Yeah,
and so he would have done fine, but...
Yeah.
Don't even for a moment make me dislike Jeff Goldblum or Rick Moranis, please. I need to maintain my image of their
Did you watch the
greatness.
new show, Chaos?
I haven't, no.
It's good. It was canceled, but I thought it was really good. Lizzie's childhood friend, Mickey Bunce, was played by Ron Eldard, a former boxer who found his way onto both the stage and the screen in the 1980s. The other actors considered for this role were Josh Brolin, Michael J. Fox, Keanu Reeves, and Charlie Sheen. But Ron just had what they were looking for, and probably those guys turned it down, I'm sure. But
can't quite see any of them going for it.
Mickey was only his second film role, but he went on to play some pretty well-known characters like John Riley in Sleepers, Dodge in Ghost Ship, Biff Loman in Death of a Salesman, and Ray Shepard in ER, who was the temporary love interest of Juliana Margulies' character, Carol Hathaway. And the two of them were actually in a relationship in real life, and they later acted together in Ghost Ship.
Nice.
He did a good bit of off-Broadway and Broadway productions, including Neil Simon's, another Neil Simon connection, Neil Simon's Biloxi Blues, On the Waterfront, and Death of a Salesman. And as the story goes, Ron was the understudy on Biloxi Blues for none other than Matthew Broderick. And just a few days before taking over the role when Broderick left the show, Neil Simon unceremoniously fired Ron at a rehearsal. And I believe this is when he pursued film acting, and I'd say it worked out for him pretty well. But the final casting highlight I want to make tonight is Lizzie's best friend, Janie, played by the lovely and hilarious Carrie Fisher, who, in the words of writer Mark Harrison, deserves a mention too for playing the rote best friend with more character than you expect from such a slim role, whose subplot is completed by reaffirming the film's reconstructive mantra.
She got a lot of moxie.
And apparently she wanted the role of Lizzie, but she was considered too old.
I think she would have nailed it.
I think she'd have been great.
Nothing against Phoebe Cates, and I'm sure it's just more the character, and we'll definitely talk about it, but I wasn't as impressed as I thought I would be.
But Carrie Fisher was, of course, most well known for her character Princess Leia in the original Star Wars trilogy, as well as her return to the role before her passing in 2016. But she had a number of other memorable roles throughout her career, many of which were cameos for the sake of harnessing the sheer magic that was Carrie Fisher.
Nostalgia.
But two of my absolute favorites are Janie in Drop Dead Fred, of course, and Carol Peterson in The Burbs.
Yeah.
I love that movie.
You do. I still haven't seen it.
And I knew she'd had some personal struggles with juggling fame, bipolar disorder, and drug addiction. But what I didn't know is that she'd written a number of nonfiction and biographical works based on these experiences and her life in general, including Postcards from the Edge, which she adapted for the screen, Wishful Drinking, Shockaholic, and The Princess Diarist, which was a memoir based on her diary entries written around the time she was cast as Leia and began filming A New Hope.
Not to be confused with the Anne Hathaway film.
The Princess Diarist.
I noticed that you enunciated it.
Yes, I tried my best. And apparently Carrie was the set favorite, and I'm not even a little bit surprised. As DeYoung put it in that Telegraph interview, he has a lot of happy memories from that production, but also a few unhappy ones. There were some actors who thought it was all nonsense and borderline vulgar, he said, and described several of the American actresses being, overly concerned with unflattering camera angles and kind of making some things more difficult than they needed to be. But the one that couldn't have cared less about any of that was Carrie Fisher, who apparently stayed friends with DeYoung until her passing.
Wow.
Paul Webster described her as a very funny, sardonic lady, and he said that Rick was a little overawed by her.
And yet, they didn't give her the lead role.
And they didn't give
Can
her
you
the lead
imagine that
role.
chemistry if he was overawed by her?
That would have been fantastic.
Although she had put up with enough of being overawed on movie sets, I'm sure.
She actually said that if she knew how famous Leia would have made her, she never would have done it.
I believe it.
She regretted the role, essentially. So from that point forward, she just kind of had fun doing whatever she wanted.
And I'm glad she got that opportunity.
I agree.
Let her be Lizzie. Jeez. You had to
Let her be Lizzie.
act like there's women, the sin of aging, you know?
Where's the time machine? Let's go back.
How old was she?
Mid-30s, like 34.
Yeah, too old.
So, old.
I
So
mean,
old.
is
I'm
that
only going to
not-
be 34 in like a week.
Yeah, I was about to say, very soon. Is that not the perfect age for your life to fall apart?
I would say so.
Early midlife crisis. I mean, it would be early, but would it not make more sense for her life to go in this direction when she was a little older?
If you look at it from a 30-year cycle standpoint.
I'm just making an argument
Sure.
on a casting decision that was made 30 some odd years ago.
Nobody asked us.
Nobody asked us. 30, what
Not
did you
one
say?
person.
34 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's belated rage on Carrie's behalf is all.
I think we all have that for her.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of talk about where to film this movie, too. Originally, it was going to be shot in the UK, but Rick Mayall was trying to branch out into international film, not just British. So this is why they cast an American in the role of Lizzie, because they needed US distribution. But it's also why principal photography took place in Minneapolis, a generic American city that was more cost-effective than New York or Los Angeles, using its downtown and various buildings for those in-the-city scenes. But majority of the film was shot at Paisley Park Studios, in the Chanhassen suburb just outside of Minneapolis.
Okay.
Paisley Park Studios was owned by Prince, and it was named after his 1985 single, Paisley Park.
Couldn't get more 80s than that if you tried.
A quick Wikipedia search told me that the Paisley Park studio complex totaled 55,000 square feet by the early 1990s and includes 4 recording studios, a 12,500 square foot soundstage, a video editing suite, rehearsal room, offices, tenant space, and an underground parking garage. Other amenities include an outdoor basketball court and living quarters. So, very, very big. And this is not only where Prince died, but he'd always wanted it to become something like Elvis Presley's Graceland. And technically, that's exactly what he got. It's now the Paisley Park Museum, with public tours managed by Graceland Holdings. And for a while, the urn holding Prince's ashes was on display in the main entrance. The urn was shaped like a miniature of Paisley Park. What is this? A studio for ants?
What a guy. I mean, hey, if I had all that money and I'd love to build some movie studios. I don't know if I'd go so far as to display my urn there.
Yeah, I don't know if he had a say in that. I'm sure there.
I would imagine he had something written up.
And there's actually been a long-standing rumor that Prince would come out at the end of the day, like each day of filming, and play music for the cast and crew. But Paul Webster debunked that myth back in 2021.
Well, damn.
But once completed, Drop Dead Fred premiered in the US on May 24th, 1991, which, by the way, May 24th, my son's due date.
Wild.
And despite being critically eviscerated, it actually wasn't a total box office bomb. It was produced on a budget of $6.7 million and made either $14 million or $24 million, depending on which source you trust.
But how many people walked out of the theater?
I mean, I would say making back twice your budget sounds all right, but the studios were not impressed.
And neither were the critics, like you said.
Rumor has it the studio executives didn't even like the movie themselves. I have no idea if that's true, but Mark Harrison said in his Den of Geek article,
"With its slapstick violence, gross-out comedy, and psychological oddities, the higher-ups were so repelled by the final cut, they tried to sell it to another studio at the last minute. During this unsuccessful turnaround period, TriStar head Mike Medavoy decried it as a children's movie on drugs." I decried it as a children's movie on drugs as well.
Critic Gene Siskel called it easily one of the worst films I've ever seen. And another writer for Empire magazine wrote, "There is scarcely a laugh to be had unless you're 6 years old or immoderately fond of such wheezes as depositing dog poop on a white carpet."
I was going to say pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
But again, like, I get it. I get why they did it, and I get what they
I do
wanted
too.
to do, and that's what makes it so painful to me, is I get it, and I just would have done it so differently.
Even Webster and DeYoung tried to give Americans the benefit of the doubt and just chalk it up to personal preference, stating that American audiences weren't quite ready for Rick Mayall's brand of anarchic humor. DeYoung said,
I think that the anarchistic mentality was alien to many critics. The film was childish, on purpose, of course. It didn't attempt to be slick and smart, though I think it is both. In a way, it glorified bad taste and ignored good behavior and a polite upbringing. It was anti-intellectual, and that's never a great invitation for film critics.
I mean...
Again, I don't disagree. It's like, I don't really get what they did. I just get what they were trying to do.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I see them trying to do it, and I'm like, if you just adjusted this a little bit, or just did this in a slightly different way, or you didn't go so over the top with it so many times in a row without that undercurrent of psychology and child psychology and understanding, like, if you just like squished that Play-Doh a little bit different, or put it in a different order or something.
Yeah, made a different shape with it. I get it. It was like almost there. It was almost a perfect movie.
Almost there.
Almost.
I compared it to Jennifer's Body earlier, or I mentioned Jennifer's Body at least, and it's the same kind of thing where if you go into it in the wrong mindset or you have the wrong outlook on what it is or could be, you're not going to get it, and you're probably not going to enjoy it.
Right.
And so it's not only a matter of what you actually do and what you put on screen, but it's also how you set it up.
This is true.
And
it's true. They had all the right ingredients.
And there's also like such a line between like satire and genuine commentary, and I wouldn't really call it satirical, but it was a little bit. Like there were elements of it that were, right? Mm-hmm. Charles, the husband, the mom. There is a lot of satire in it, but the core of the movie and what they were trying to do with it isn't satirical.
Right.
So it's like there's this kind of warring like undercurrent. They couldn't decide what the undercurrent needed
heartfelt.
To be.
Yeah.
So
it's that juxtaposition between childhood and adulthood.
And it landed in the PG-13 middle that didn't really make sense to anybody.
It's a perfect millennial movie. It had everything that we loved as kids and everything deeper to it that we appreciate as adults.
It tried to. I can't say that it did, but it tried to.
They made it, I think it did, surface level, but that's because it was made in 1990, like there wasn't much there. There wasn't much depth.
If any filmmaker was approaching this today, yes.
They made it for an audience that was still in diapers. Like they made it for an audience that was still picking their noses.
That didn't yet know what was coming.
But it wouldn't be appreciated until those kids who loved the movie were grown up and could look back at it.
Right.
Like it literally...
Which is very cool.
It existed to be analyzed 30 years later.
Which is honestly very cool. Like that's hard to do because you almost can't do it intentionally. You can try and you can guess. It's like Labyrinth, like it's in that vein of like they'll never really know, but the adults in that case did have the perspective and the hindsight. Adults in this case really didn't. Because a generation like that, a generation that was made promises or, mind your P's and Q's, do what you're told, show up, and then it's all going to work out for you. And it did for most other generations.
Yeah.
Gen X, it started to fall apart. And then for millennials, it really fell apart. So
big time.
Yeah, it's the benefit of that is crazy to think about. And another reason that they were kind of ahead of their time and also behind the science, they didn't really have the language to talk about and address the things and the ideas that they were trying to tease at.
Absolutely.
The language, even if they did have it, wasn't commonplace.
Absolutely.
Like you said, there wasn't that focus on mental health or any type of awareness around it. So they were speaking a language that they didn't have words for. And it came out very, very garbled and jumbled because of that.
It was almost like they didn't know what they were talking about, but they were still like getting it right.
Yeah, like a broken clock is right twice a day.
I actually cut this quote. I was going to save it for part 2, but this is something that the producer said that I thought was very relevant. I just didn't know where to place it. So here,
throw it to me.
Go ahead and read that.
It still resonates today, 30 years later. I don't think anyone could have anticipated that, but the whole notion of an inner child is much more accepted today. As a society, we're more comfortable with our feelings and therapy is widely accepted. As time has gone on, those themes in the film that deal with mental illness have come to the surface and contemporary audiences embrace that.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like it was there. They had all the ingredients. They even had some of the buzzwords.
But again, it's like they were kind of edging it. They never really got there. They never really said it. The climax wasn't. It didn't hit. But it could have.
Dime store psychoanalysis.
Yeah. It could have.
They hung on too much to the comedy aspect of
and
it.
really leaned on it when they didn't know what else to do.
And then right there at the end, to wrap everything up and make it all nice and neat, they then jumped deeply into
which is exactly me sitting on my couch watching it, was when I was like, why wasn't the whole movie like that? Bingo.
Exactly.
You know.
Exactly.
But by the time they got there, it didn't land the way that it could have.
But I still don't think it would have been appreciated even then.
Not in its time, no.
It just would have been a very different conversation about the movie now on our podcast.
Yeah.
They tried. De Jong was there. That's just, I think that's like one of the results of like having trauma but not talking about it.
It's in you. It lives and breathes,
everything
and it's there
in your life.
Yeah.
But until you talk about it, it's just going to kind of muddy all the waters, you know, of your existence, and just kind of like people can kind of tell there's something there, but nobody ever really like addresses it. And so, yeah, you can never really get beneath that surface. Yeah. But maybe they were afraid to go too much deeper. You know, I don't know.
But then again, they weren't afraid of many things. So
yeah, I don't see.
The fear was misplaced. If so, I could say some places where maybe they shouldn't have gone, but maybe they should have been afraid of that part instead.
Misplaced fear.
But again, yeah, they didn't know if audiences were going to get it, so they just went as wacky and crazy as they could.
So we see the potential of this movie, and we understand why critics didn't like it.
Yeah, very much.
But I think Alexander Larman makes a really good point in his Telegraph article, which tells the story of a bit of, quoting, embarrassing car crash television that took place when Rick Mayall was doing interviews to promote his new film. This singularly horrible event happened to occur on Late Night with David Letterman, who just couldn't help himself from reacting in a very harsh way to not only the film clip that they showed as a preview, but also to Rick himself as a person.
Oh my God.
As Larman puts it,
Letterman behaved throughout as if Mayall's presence was a tiresome obligation that he had to suffer through, playing to the audience for incredulous laughs. And an obviously nervous Mayall, introduced incredulously as one of England's most popular comedians, barely restrained himself from swearing, made off-color jokes about fires and orphanages and tampons and red wine, and referred to himself as a blood-drenched sex vampire from the bowels of Hades.
He wasn't doing himself any favors there.
No. I was going to say, was he doing this in response to Letterman kind of blowing him off, or was he just going to do that anyway?
That's just kind of what he does. He just says whatever comes to mind. But with Letterman cringing and wincing, he successfully conveyed to America that this man might be funny in England, but we Americans find him crude and disgusting.
Acting like Americans have any decorum at all.
I know. Effectively setting it up for moral failure in front of American audiences just 2 days later.
Woof.
And because of the film's considerable failure, Mayall never starred in another American film.
Wow.
Which is sad and unfair, because almost all American comedy went the way of bizarro gross-out humor in less than a decade, with the rise of the likes of Jim Carrey, Adam Sandler, Mike Myers, and plenty of others.
American Pie exists.
American Pie, oh my God. Like,
it's called American Pie.
Yeah, so we weren't ready for him yet, but if we just given it a chance.
What did Marty McFly say? You're not ready for it, but your kids are going to love it.
There's some raunchy comedies from the 70s and 80s, let me tell you.
I guess there's a difference between raunch, although there was some, but I guess there's a difference between raunchy and just
I guess so.
childishly distasteful.
Childishly raunchy. Oh, it doesn't, that doesn't work.
No.
No, that doesn't work.
But that's what it is. I wish that you weren't right.
At least raunchy comedies had their audience. They had a way to make money. They knew who to play to. This movie,
teens, early 20s.
A lot of people were saying that I've read, like, this movie was completely unmarketable because it was the only people who could
advertise it to?
The only people who could appreciate it were children, and yet so many of the themes go way over their head. There's no way they could appreciate it for what it actually was about.
It's so interesting. It's so interesting because we're talking about how it was that weird middle ground. Where do you put it? It's all these themes are middle ground, but exactly like you're saying, the only people that could watch it at face value and get anything from it at the time were very young children or much older adults who had been through midlife crises or, had faced some of those demons or childhood, issues or traumas. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's so
Those
funny.
were the ends of the spectrum that may have gotten something from it, good or bad or indifferent.
Yeah.
And yet it's a PG-13 movie that they expected teenagers to go in and enjoy.
Speaking of face value, there's another quote I didn't use, but this is a perfect segue to it. This Den of Geek article, he says, it's definitely a film about overcoming emotional abuse, but neither the film nor its subtext could ever be called subtle. The subtext is dressed in garish green and yellow, demanding that you take it at face value.
Right.
So it's like, it is such a paradox because, it's about overcoming abuse, and yet here's this leprechaun freaking screaming in your face about mega bitches and shit, and it's like
and wiping dog poop on the carpet,
rubbing dog poop on the carpet, and you're like, what am I supposed to get from this film?
Yeah.
Like, what's the takeaway?
Which is what
here?
I asked myself sitting on my couch in the last 2 weeks a couple different times. So here's a question that I have that I've been asking myself and trying to figure out what would have made it different or hit different or be different. Marketing is one, and having a place to put it is another. But if it hadn't been so over the top, whether the casting was different or not, we could argue Robin Williams or Jim Carrey or whomever.
Yeah.
If the casting had been different, okay. Or if it had been dialed back, if there were 2 or 3 less scenes just about gross out stuff,
right?
Would it have hit differently, do you think? If it had happened one time that he was gross and outlandish, then we all get the point. Inner child, whatever. We unhealed, we all get the point then. If it happened once, but it happened 30 times.
It happened a lot. I also think that they used it as a reason to not let their kids watch it, or they used it as an excuse to hate the movie and tell
which is
other
exactly
people
my point.
Not to watch it.
Then why?
But
you didn't do yourself any favors. I'm not saying don't make raunchy things or things that are hard to market, but
so it's been described as a kids movie and also a family friendly movie, right? So
not either of those things.
It's not either of those things. Let's say that they do dial back the gross out, they do dial back all that stuff, and it becomes a family movie. Well, the point...
But it still isn't, because the point of it is that it's about a young woman in her 20s whose life is falling apart.
Unresolved childhood trauma.
It's still not a family movie.
It's not a family movie.
The plot of it isn't a family movie.
Yeah, if it was just a feel-good comedy about a girl whose imaginary friend comes back to her in adulthood, and there's this wacky...
Yes.
It's a wacky comedy, and they get up to, some no good, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But
and there's a place to put that.
There is a place for that.
And there would have been a place to put a really smart, psychologically, make you think movie that
is only for adults, but not a family movie.
Right.
But it was too gross out for adults at the time.
They were waiting for the kids in diapers who were watching Slime Time Live and all that. And you can't do that on television to grow up. But we hadn't
yet. They can only find their audience by raising the audience.
Raising them.
Growing up with the audience. I don't want to use the word grooming because that's too much.
No, I understand what you mean.
They had to raise their audience.
Basically, yeah.
Oh, God.
That's so weird, but weirdly true. I can say with certainty, it's really hard for me to say this about most things. A lot of times there are, and of course we have compared it. Beetlejuice, there are contemporary Gremlins, this style of irreverent children's comedy, dark humor. We've talked about that.
Yeah.
But listener, if you're listening and you haven't watched the film, or you're listening and you did and you're like, what the hell just happened to me?
Yeah.
Then there is something I can say about this film that I don't think I've ever said on the podcast, or really about any piece of media that I've talked about in life, which is nothing has ever made me feel quite the way this film did.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's the best way I think I can describe it. So I don't know if that's a glowing review to send you off and watch it because you're wondering, but I can say that. That's something I can say.
On this vein, I found a movie guide article, a .org, which, by the way, has an advertisement for The Chosen. So you know what kind of content they prefer. It's very overly Christian. Even more disturbing is that these imaginary friends, more than one appear in the film, who guide us into a supposedly enlightened state, bring to mind, at least for Christians, semblances of demons.
Yes.
It says, Added to the occultic overtones are elements of scatological humor, sexual innuendo, and close to 30 instances of obscenity, profanity, making for a film that everyone will want to avoid.
I mean,
but they're upset
a,
about him decapitating dolls.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so.
This is an interesting tie,
funny.
though, because I think there is something to be said. Like we were talking about the American decorum earlier.
Mhm.
Really, the only semblance of American decorum that we could probably conjure would be on that side of the fence.
Oh,
you know?
absolutely.
From that
Absolutely.
perspective, it was never going to go anywhere. It never could. And the themes, interestingly, you're talking about like they're almost describing it as demonic.
Mhm.
And then you were talking about the sense of impending doom, and there's
Yeah.
the psychological darkness to it. Like I got that vibe. And I think as a kid, I would have read it sort of demonic too. I really think I would have. And I wasn't even,
Yeah.
I was in a very, very conservative, church, and that wasn't really a thought process. It wasn't like a spiritual warfare kind of situation in my mind, my child mind. But he was so irreverent in such a disturbed kind of way
Mhm.
that I think I would have, I could have placed that demonic read.
Is Fred like a poltergeist? Like what is he? Because he just sort
I
of.
had the same thoughts.
He's been described as haunting Lizzie too
Yeah.
in other
Yeah.
articles. So I'm like, it is almost. It is. There is a
especially
dark element
when he
to
appears
it.
and the dolls and like where are we and like trying to like get his bearings on where she is in life.
Mhm.
It does feel that way.
There's a pretty dark element to all of that. But there is the overarching point that sometimes you have to tear things apart in order to put them back together
Mm-hmm.
properly.
Sure.
Sometimes you have to break a bone
Yeah.
to set it correctly.
Sometimes
That's kind of the
things
whole.
fall apart.
That's
so
the
better things can
metaphor
fall together.
of Fred. Like,
Yeah.
that's the.
He's chaos. He's destruction. But it's the phoenix. It's the Ouroboros. It's the
Yes,
rebirth. The
absolutely.
death comes before the rebirth.
There it is. We've
All
gotten
true.
in our Ouroboros reference. We're done.
Yeah.
We've
Caitlin's
succeeded.
Token Ouroboros reference per episode. No, but I mean, and that's what I'm saying. That's why I'm sitting here saying there is so much depth to this that could be so good.
So good. I know.
And I think is so smart if executed just a little differently. I keep saying it. Y'all are going to get so sick of me saying that by part 2. You're going to be like, oh my God, we get it. And I'm not necessarily even saying I could have done better. I would like to try. I'm not saying I could have done better, but somebody could have.
Somebody could have. I don't know. I think it had to have been made then. The way that it was made, it had to be made then. But if it was made now, it would be done.
It would be done
so
different.
much differently and so much better.
It's fascinating that it was made then.
Mm-hmm.
You convinced me, Christian.
I did it.
The first 10 minutes of the movie, I was like, what the and you've sold me.
Not the first time I've done
belongs.
that on this show,
It's true. It belongs here.
but I'm glad I've done it. You know who I think should produce, if not direct, a reboot or a sequel?
Who?
Sean Levy, who produced
Okay.
Stranger Things.
Yeah.
I
That
think-
would be
I think he should
very
jump
cool.
in
Mm-hmm.
and he should direct, because he's doing a lot of directing now. I think he should jump in, make Drop Dead Fred the way we're talking about it.
Make it smart, psychological, elements of comedy, edge, dark humor, age it. That's actually a really funny commentary. I didn't know when I started that sentence whether I wanted to say age it up or age it down. I didn't know which to say.
Yeah, I know,
I
right?
really didn't.
It's confusing.
Age the plot down a little bit. Make it a college life crisis, maybe.
Yes.
Age the
Don't
plot
make
down.
it such a
And
drastic.
age
Yeah.
the characterizations, not necessarily the characters, but the characterizations up.
Mm-hmm.
Meet in the middle. I'm just laughing at myself because I was like so confidently, just age it.
Just age it. Oh,
age
shit.
it at all. Age it differently.
Age it. You know
Pick
what?
one.
Age it.
Pick a team. It needs you. Get my Lorelai Gilmore reference in there too.
Well, I'm glad we're having this much trouble talking about it. It
Yeah,
makes me
bodes
feel better
very well.
that, you're kind of in the same place I'm in. As Alexander Larman says in his article, 3 decades on, it is possible to reassess Drop Dead Fred not as an asinine exercise in grossed out stupidity, but as a sophisticated and ahead of its time black comic exploration of mental illness.
I would omit the but and the nots and say and.
It can be
Instead.
both.
2 things can be true at once.
Porque no los dos.
Both is good.
So that's the angle from which we intend to rewatch this movie. And I think it's well deserved. And I'd challenge anyone to do the same thing with other comedies with actual mainstream appeal like Dumb and Dumber, Waterboy, and Austin Powers.
I'm sure there's a podcast out there doing it.
You know what? Maybe they're doing it well. Maybe they're doing a great job. Although I will admit that there's usually a great deal more to sink your teeth into with dark comedies versus
Fully agree.
others. And that's why I've always loved them.
Same. That's always my preference if I have to pick.
Probably because of the inappropriate kids movies that we grew up on. Those nostalgic gems like Drop Dead Fred. So that's it for part 1.
Damn.
Stay tuned for part 2 coming at you real soon, where we'll take an even deeper look into the psychology of imaginary friends, the effects of unresolved childhood trauma, and the importance of reparenting our inner child.
Yeah.
If you were ever doubtful, don't worry. It's going to get pretty dark, y'all.
Go watch it and let us know at what point you had to turn it off.
Or at what point you got it. It clicked.
Or,
You went,
at what point
"Oh,
it clicked.
That's it. I got it now. I know what they're talking about it. Here we go. Here we go. Very excited to jump into this.
Yeah.
I love this movie.
Wow.
It's been a long time. I haven't, kind of like The Rescuers with you, I hadn't watched it since I was a little kid. So I forgot it. Like I literally forgot it existed.
Fascinating perspective to have kind of your own time capsule of it.
It's wonderful.
I'll say that much.
This is one of the, every time we talk about it, you're like, we've done most of the movie nights. I'm like, we have so many of my childhood favorites to get to.
My childhood movie nights, we've done
Your
a lot of.
childhood movie nights. Mine
are just getting started.
Still yet to come. Oh, they're just getting started, y'all. This one's fun. We're going to have fun with it. Thanks for listening, and I hope you guys enjoyed as much as I do.
And if you want to keep enjoying us, you can find us on social media at That's Pretty Dark Podcast, at That's Pretty Dark on TikTok. You can email us if you want to tell us your opinions, because I am genuinely dropping dead to know how you feel about this movie at That's Pretty Dark Podcast at gmail.com. And if you really, really like us, like a lot, you can find us on patreon.com/TPD podcast and contribute some of your hard-earned dollars to our hard-earned podcast content.
I like it.
And some behind the scenes.
I love it.
Over there, back there, around there.
I want some more of it.
Is that it?
I think that's it. Let's let him get back to it. I'm gonna let you go.
If y'all don't know, that's a very southern way to get off the phone when you're just done with a conversation. Now, all right, well, I'm gonna let you go. I'm gonna let you go now.
I'm gonna let you go.
All right then. That was my dad, my uncle, his parents. They'd say, all right then, and that was the cue of like, it's over now.
Slap your leg and so start standing up. Well.
That's the Midwestern goodbye. Been a pleasure.
My new favorite is just to say, well, I'm out of words. So
yeah, I'm out now.
I'm done. I'm done talking.
That's all I got. That's all I gotta say. I say that pretty much every time I get to the end of a podcast episode. I'm
That's
like,
all I have to say.
I've talked myself to death. That's it.
Yep, saving my words.
See if I can find some more words for next time.
Saving my words for part 2. Thanks for listening, guys.
Bye. We'll see you soon.
Bye. That's Pretty Dark Podcast is produced by Kaylin Andrews and me, Christian Baxter Mott.
With music by Jonathan Simmons and cover design by Halftone Horror.
You can support our show by supporting our sponsors, or go to patreon.com/TPD podcast to unlock all the Pretty Dark bonus content we have in store.
Please share your experiences and let us know what shows, films, or villains still haunt you from childhood on our socials or at that'sprettydarkpodcast@gmail.com.
For all other information, visit our website, that'sprettydark.com.
Remember, you're never really alone.
So, until next time, sweet dreams, everyone.